Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarah Curitin, Executive Director of the New Jersey Historical Commission, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, New Jersey, the last northern state to end slavery. This week, for the first time, New Jersey will observe Juneteenth as a state holiday. Tonight's program offers all of us an opportunity to learn more about Juneteenth and New Jersey's relationship to the brutal institution of slavery. As we will learn from our speakers, although a northern state, New Jersey sanctioned the legal enslavement of African Americans beyond the historic Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. We hope tonight's program will help prepare all of us to both celebrate the abolition of slavery in the United States and better understand its impact on our own state. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Noelle Lorraine Williams. Noelle joined the Commission staff in March of this year, assuming the role of Director of the Commission's African American History Program. In just a few short months, she has used her considerable skills as a historian, artist, and curator to build new programs, such as the Speakers Series we inaugurate tonight, and strengthen existing ones. We are also joined by our incredibly capable Chief Communications Officer, Greer Luce, who serves as our webmaster and will assist with the Q&A segment at the end. And now, let me hand it off to Noelle Lorraine Williams.
Thank you, Sarah. I am just so happy to be here kicking off the Commission's new series, Black is African American Sites and History in New Jersey. And it is an auspicious sign that the first conversation is in honor of New Jersey's first Juneteenth commemoration. African Americans have had a complex and inspirational experience in New Jersey since the 1600s. This land is now called New Jersey, but the land which we now acknowledge is the homeland of the Lenape. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all of the enslaved people in the United States. West Virginia, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri were allowed to keep slavery intact. Though it applied to them, enslaved people in Tallahassee, Florida, were not notified of the Emancipation Proclamation until May, 1 month before Juneteenth. Though it officially ended in December when ratified by the government, slavery's final legal death in New Jersey occurred on January 23rd, 1866, when in his first official act as governor, Marcus L. Ward of Newark signed a state constitutional amendment that brought about an absolute end to slavery in the state. In other words, the institution of slavery in New Jersey survived for months following the Declaration of Freedom in Texas. However, today we are here to have a conversation about emancipation and to commemorate Juneteenth as a symbol of the emancipation of African Americans across the United States. But before I introduce Dr. Jagentino and Dr. Amemasor, I would like to pose a question in the opening and the closing for us all to think about as we go throughout this weekend. The question is, what is at stake if we do not present and learn a more truthful and layered African American history in New Jersey? How does not learning hold us back from understanding what it really means to be American? And now I will introduce to you Dr. James Amensore. Dr. Amemasor is a research specialist at the New Jersey Historical Society Library. His pilot study for the Society-sponsored initiative, History, Memory, and Acknowledgement, the African Diaspora in New Jersey, has laid the essential groundwork for future research by discovering and documenting unknown and overlooked materials in the Society's archives relating to people of African descent from colonial times to present. His ongoing research includes documenting runaway slave advertisements in New Jersey newspapers between 1777 and 1808. Alongside his work at the Society, Dr. Amemasor teaches courses in political science at Rutgers University, Newark. He previously worked at the Cape Coast Castle Museum in Ghana, a key site to understanding the transatlantic slave trade, where he coordinated educational activities for multinational visitors visiting the castle dungeons. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Amemasor to the conversation tonight, and he should definitely correct me on the pronunciation of his name, even though we've been friends for years. And I would also like to encourage the audience to put any questions in the Q&A. Feel free to post any comments in the chat, and we will have questions at the end of the program. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Noelle, and thanks to the New Jersey Historical Commission for the opportunity to talk about my research on slavery, and to do so on the occasion of the New Jersey's first commemoration of Juneteenth. At the New Jersey Historical Society where I work, I use the library and archival collections to provide assistance to researchers on a range of topics. Besides linking researchers to critical resources, I engage in my own historical research to help established and rising scholars gain greater clarity in their research. In that context, I have two research projects that are ongoing. The first one is titled No Longer Unknown Manuscript Materials Relating to People of African Descent, housed in the New Jersey Historical Society archives. It started as a pilot study in support of a New Jersey Historical Society-sponsored social framework initiative titled History, Memory, and Acknowledgement, the African Diaspora in New Jersey. It was directed by Dr. Linda Epps, former CEO and president of the New Jersey Historical Society. The goal of that initiative was to increase public awareness of and scholarly access to the Society's archival collections relating to people of African descent. And my primary role in that initiative was to research, discover, document the Society's negligible but considerably unforgettable manuscript materials that reference people of African descent, materials that were unknown and or overlooked over the years and therefore have no finding guides available. Such an undertaking was deemed necessary to help broaden understanding of and appreciation for the contributions of people of African origin, both free and enslaved, to the history and development of New Jersey from the colonial period, and to make the finding guides complete, inclusive, and appealing to people of diverse backgrounds and interests. The manuscript materials that I reviewed, they include daybooks or record books, estate inventories, business records, slave bills and deeds for sale, African Americans in the military, church records, land deeds involving Black people, receipts, birth registers, depositions, wills and testaments, family papers, copybooks, early census summaries. These were some of the things I went through. And I found references that were probably considered or regarded as marginal and therefore beneath, quote and unquote, the dignity of history. And all the processors simply failed to notice their significance. And they include new and diverse sources and resources for the study of enslavement, dispossession, and marginalization dating back to the founding of New Jersey. Examples include Philip Cartwright, the first New Jersey colonial governor's will, dated 1682. This will records or documents the governor's enslaved Black people. Another document was John Fenwick's will. John Fenwick was the founder of the first English settlement in West Jersey. His will was dated 1683, and it has references to marginalization of his granddaughter, Elizabeth, because his granddaughter had an affair with a Black man and had a child by her. Other records include Governor Jonathan Belcher, who paid $48 for an enslaved Black person in 1750. Jacob Spicer had a slave from Cape May. Stevens' family of Pet Amboy, Lebanon Valley, Hoboken, and their involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. General Jonathan Dayton, who was the youngest signer of the US Constitution and the third Speaker of the US House of Representatives. William Patterson was the signer of the US Constitution and second governor of the state of New Jersey, and later Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court. Documents showing he also owned an enslaved person. Reverend Dr. Alexander McWhorter of the First Presbyterian Church of Newark. Joseph C. Hornblower, Chief Justice of New Jersey Supreme Court between 1832 and 1846, who is celebrated as an anti-slavery jurist, which is true, but before he became an anti-slavery jurist, he owned slaves. And then, of course, Justice P. Bradley, who practiced law in Newark before his appointment to the Supreme Court. His interpretations of the 13th and 14th Amendments, which scholars argue brought Reconstruction to an end. These are some of the things I found. There are other documents about free Black people living in New Jersey and engaging in other activities, but that's for another day to talk about. Here is an example of Governor Belcher, who lived in Elizabeth, and this is a record book or day book of the Honorable Stevens. So you can see His Excellency Jonathan Belcher paid for a Negro boy 48 pounds. Here is also another entry for Negroes, and that is the value. These are sort of the resources that I had gone through. Here you can see the same day book passages of 41 Negroes from Antigua, 1750, at the total cost of 82 pounds. That's how he paid for them to come. So you could see that there were activities, or quite a number of people across New Jersey were involved in this kind of work, or enslavement and dispossession. It is quite a task to research and document references to enslaved and marginalized people in the surviving records of the agents of their marginalization. Undertaking such a project is like looking for a needle in a haystack. But this work has laid essential groundwork for future research. My second ongoing research project is on runaway slave advertisement in New Jersey's own newspapers. New Jersey was the last of the 13 colonies to start publishing its own newspapers continuously. And this started in 1777. Before then, New Jersey relied on Philadelphia and New York City for news. The New Jersey Historical Commission awarded me a research grant for this project. And I must say that without that grant, it would have been very difficult for me to pursue this study. Now, the project documents the moral and intellectual tensions between slavery and freedom in New Jersey, in the period between the signing or the beginning of the first printed newspaper in New Jersey and the official end of the United States' involvement in the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. It collects, transcribes, and interprets runaway slave ads from a diverse array of New Jersey newspapers that are held in repositories both inside and outside of New Jersey. The period under review, particularly the time frame between the signing of the peace treaty or the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War in 1783, and the official end of the transatlantic slave trade, was free of major warfare, but it witnessed vibrant debates about slavery and liberty, debates that tested and refined New Jersey's founding principles. Now, here are some of the basic things you find in some of these runaway advertisements. They were given names like first name, for instance, a Negro man called Joe, and then their racial identifiers, Negro, Black, Wench, Mulatto, African, their place of abode, where they were, gender, age, height, physical description, color, and so forth, occupation, language skills, reading skills, and then of course, very importantly, some of them personally wrote their own passes, and they need pass to show that they were free. Because every Black person was presumed to be a slave until proven otherwise. So the point is that there were Black people who were free in New Jersey from the colonial period. So runaway slaves used that opportunity to write their own passes and show to whoever wanted to intercede that they were free people. And as you can see, these were other things, their ambitions, their capacities, motivation, why they were running away, personality, date of escape, and the number of weeks the ads were supposed to run in the newspapers. It could be like TF stands for till found. So the ads could run for like a year based on the interest of the owner. And of course, it's also open business for jail operators, because when they were arrested, captured, they were put in jail until the owner could get them. So these are some of the basic information about them. Now, here is a photo of New Jersey's, a copy of New Jersey's first publicly or openly or continuously published newspaper in New Jersey called the New Jersey Gazette. It was first published in Burlington, and the first issue was December 5th, 1777. And you can see here, the date was December 5th, 1777, but this slave ad was dated December 4th, 1777, which tells us that slavery was already in existence. But here you can see, Runaway yesterday, the third instant from the subscriber, and this is from Menham in New Jersey. And so the owner was living in Mount Holly. He was living in Mount Holly, a Negro man named Quash, but may probably change it for Yera. By trade, a Cooper, about 26 years old of age, 5 feet 8 inches high, speaks plain, hard on, and here it describes the items he took with him. Pair of stripped, all kinds of things, shirts and new things and old ones that he had to carry. One wonder, why would a runaway person carry all these things? Because these were very dear to him. They were the things he considered very dear. And then of course, the likely destination of such an enslaved person or running away was Philadelphia or the American camp. And this was the time when the Revolutionary War was going on. And so why was he running there? Because he is fond of soldiery, loves to be, in the battlefield. Now, the owner, John Jones. So this was Mount Holly in Burlington County. Now here's another ad, and this is what actually attracted me to this research. $2,000 reward for runaway. And actually there were 3 runaways, a Negro man called Joe, about 30 years of age, 5 feet 8 inches high, one leg shorter, a little shorter than the other, part of one of his great toes cut off, lost some 4 teeth, and his back is much scarified. and in lamps by whipping. Also a handsome Negro wench, a woman, a black woman, 18 years of age. But more importantly, she had a child, about 6 weeks old. And so from what they could tell, maybe she had already killed the baby. Now these Negroes went with a horse or 2 horses. So the owner is advertising, say whoever takes up said Negroes and horses so that the owner may get them again shall have the above reward, $1,200 or $1,200 for the Negroes only. And this was December 27, 1780. And the ad was supposed to run for 3 weeks. And of course, it gave incentives to slave hunters who also had business to capture slaves for benefits. Here is another ad, half Joe, which was a form of money in this time period for a Negro man named Jack, about 18 years of age, and he talks about the personal traits. He is a remarkable, handy fellow at all kinds of housework, can talk Low Dutch well, which is a Dutch language, and when in company with other blacks is very forward, but before his superiors, very humble. And then this was placed in Newark. The owner was George Ogilvy. There are other ads, you can see here, 2 Negro boys, 17 years of age, supposed to be runaways. So someone arrested them, suspected to be runaways. They were enslaved. They were probably free, but he captured them and put them in a gaol, which was a jail in Trenton. And the ad was placed in Trenton by someone who arrested them. And the ad was supposed to run for 1 week. What do we know about these individuals? Did the owner actually got them after 1 week? Nobody knows. Now, there are other ads like that broadly. As you can see, Elizabeth, here a native called, or a man called York. He was a native of Africa, though he talks good English. And about 24 years old, civil fellow, and he talks about his personality, on and on and on. And this was Elizabethtown, 1787. And here, a Negro man or mulatto fellow named Titus, about 20 years old, and describes him in greater detail. But this is very important. The enslaved person or the runaway carried with him a pocket pistol. And the ad was placed in Elizabethtown, 1791. Now, Essex County, this is striking. So something very similar, Negro man called York or Jacob, but this is what is of interest. It is likely he has a past with him of his own writing. Again, these are some of the things we get to know reading these ads, that enslaved people, usually we thought, well, they could not read and write, but some definitely could read and write, and could write their own passes. Here was an ad placed in Woodbridge, 1797, by a man called John Marsh. And of course, a characteristic of that enslaved person who was running away was that he can both read and write, and is naturally fond of reading. So can we imagine if that individual was given the freedom to pursue, his God-given talent? You would have been someone very important. You wouldn't have been a runaway person. Here is an ad about a Negro man named Kedo, 34 years old, 5 feet 5 inches high. And this is very important. So he pretends to be religious, calls himself a Methodist, is a great liar, understands driving team and turning business. And then he describes the sort of things he carried with him. And this was an ad placed in Elizabeth. This is very important. This an enslaved person called Will, about 49 years old, 5 feet 8 inches tall, and he spoke Low Dutch, and if I can say, and a good English, not so very black as many of the African race. He was found in Providence, which was Rhode Island. And then at some point he was discovered in Lyme, Connecticut. And then because he was pursued, he found a way to get out of Connecticut and now supposed to be in other parts of the eastern states. So this was a determined person. And this ad was in Newark. He was very determined to gain his freedom. Now, talking about all this in the context of the American Revolution. The American Revolution, or the American experiment in liberty, was imperfect from the very beginning. The revolution advanced ideals of universal human equality, but left intact the economic and social underpinnings of slavery. But those ideals had their own effects as enslaved people, slaveholders, slave traders, slave hunters, and abolitionists. They all had to grapple with the reality and promise of freedom in a post-revolutionary landscape. And fugitive slave advertisements provide a unique perspective on those principles. They provide a valuable window into how runaway slave cultures and conditions shaped New Jersey's history. And they give us or provide us very important opening for interpreting slaveholders and enslaved people's reactions to the ideals spawned by the American Revolution. In conclusion, what I want to say about slavery briefly is that it's a very broad field to be studied. But what is so important about it, and I quote this very often, it's a statement by a Ghanaian poet and scholar called Kojo Opoku-Agyeman, who wrote about this and says, slavery is the living wound under the patchwork of scars. That metaphor means a lot. It's a wound that has not healed. And the surface has been patched, but the down of the wound is still very fresh. Why? Because a lot of time has passed, yet whole nations cry, sometimes softly, sometimes harshly, often without knowing why. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Amemasor. That was a powerful presentation. I'm sure there are going to be questions at the end, and we look forward to continuing this conversation today, but in the months and years to come. And so now I will introduce Dr. Jagentino. Dr. Jen Gigantino is a professor of history and currently serves as the Associate Dean of the Graduate School in International Education. He has previously served as the chair of the Department of History and Associate Chair and Director of Graduate Studies. He is the author of 2 books, The Ragged Road to Abolition, Slavery and Freedom in New Jersey, 1775 to 1865, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2014, and William Livingston's American Revolution, also published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018. He is also the editor of 2 books, Slavery and Secession in Arkansas, University of Arkansas Press, and The American Revolution in New Jersey, Where the Battlefront Meets the Homefront, Rutgers University Press, both published in 2015. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jen Gigantino.
Thank you, Noelle. It's great to be here with you all, and I want to especially thank the Historical Commission. The Commission was a very early supporter of my work as a young graduate student, and now that I'm in charge of all of the graduate students at the University of Arkansas, I know how incredibly important that research support was for me, but also how it's support for all of our graduate students who are working on really powerful topics in New Jersey history. I want to share today a little bit about, and hopefully you can see my screen, about some interesting ideas about gradual abolition and the law. And I wanted to start out talking about a very important person to me This person begins and ends my book project, and I start with her very often when I talk about slavery and abolition in New Jersey, because she's a really good window at thinking about how this system of gradual abolition operates. So this is an image from the Hunterdon County Historical Society, and going back to what James was talking about in his presentation about really the importance of really looking at and understanding how in our archive collections across New Jersey, how we have such a rich repository of information about slavery, but it's very difficult to find such things. So this particular book that has a lot of different things in it. Over the years, they've put everything from birth announcements for slaves in it that were, or birth announcements for children born to slaves after 1804. We'll get to that in a little bit. But kind of buried in the way back of the book, at the one of the very last entries, is this one concerning a slave named Catherine. So Catherine was born in 1789. She's born in Amwell Township, and she's 15 years old in 1804 when the state passed a law for the gradual abolition of slavery. And so, Catherine, nothing really changed between for Catherine during this moment, this very powerful, important moment in New Jersey's history in 1804, when the state legislature passes this law. It didn't really do anything for Catherine, and I always talk about how it's in some ways rather uneventful. Even in the state legislature, they pass a bill on a new turnpike road, and then a additional tax on dogs, and then the gradual abolition of slavery is stuck between those two bills. So really, it challenged me as a young graduate student and researcher to think about, well, what is this 1804 moment really mean? And it gets to the heart of what this gradual abolition law and what abolition looks like in New Jersey. Now, it didn't impact Catherine's life as a 15-year-old when this law was passed, but it did have impact for Catherine's two children. She has children. One, Bob, was born in 1811, and Hannah in 1815. And so what happens with those children becomes incredibly important as this idea of gradual abolition really comes about. What happens to Catherine, though, is she's continuing to live her life as a slave. By 1840, she shows up again in the historical record. She's now 51 years of age in 1840, and she moves with her master, John Hageman, to Raritan Township. And 6 years later, in 1846, now she's 57, her status changes because in 1846, the state of New Jersey outlaws the institution of slavery, but it replaces it with people like Catherine no longer becoming slaves, but they become apprentices for life. So her legal status changes, but her actual life and her experiences don't change. She shows up for the last time in the historical record in 1856 in the document that you're looking at right now. When in 1856, she's now 67 years of age. Her owner, John Hageman, sold her to a man from Somerset County for $20 in 1856. So Catherine's life and the children that she has that are impacted by the gradual abolition law, they really tell us a complicated and elongated story about how slavery didn't end in 1804 when the gradual abolition law is passed, and really challenge us to think about how the lives of these people, you know, in the 19th century is affected by these legal changes. So the first thing I want to, you know, touch on with this transformation in the 19th century is really the role of the American Revolution. And as James talked about, the American Revolution creates this idea about freedom and creates this idea about how freedom functions in the American experience. Now in New Jersey, what typically a lot of historians in the past have thought about is that New Jersey is, in general, slavery in the North is kind of in its death throes. That the revolution and this ideology of the revolution really destroys the institution of slavery across the North, because we see gradual abolition laws pass in New England first, and then in New York in 1799, and then finally in New Jersey in 1804. So we are, what I argue in my research is that that's, for New Jersey case, that's not true. New Jersey is actually not in the death throes of slavery. Slavery in New Jersey is not in its death throes. It's actually quite expanding in the period after the American Revolution. Now, New Jersey has a very interesting history, because in New Jersey, we are seeing New Jersey being divided in the colonial and revolutionary period between East and West Jersey. So now in the western part of the state, so we're talking about areas like Sussex and Hunterdon, Burlington, Gloucester, Salem, Cumberland, Cape May. In those parts of western New Jersey, slavery is dying. So for example, in a place like Salem County, between 1790 and 1800, slavery is in massive decline. It's going down by 50%. But in the eastern part of the state, slavery is growing. So in a place like Essex County, slavery is increasing by 30% over that 10-year period of time. And what's even more interesting, it's not the stubborn slaveholder who is holding on to their slaves and not giving them freedom. It is actually a younger generation of slaveholders who are very interested in continuing this system of slavery, and then even expanding this institution of slavery. Now, when we think about this idea of gradual abolition, we have to really, and what an abolitionist is in this period of time, it's really important to think about this political abolition movement as something that's a lot more complex, because abolition is, for white New Jerseyans, is really about how politically they can come to power in the state. In 1800, the state is at this precipice of this Jeffersonian revolution that's sweeping across the country. The Democratic Republican or Jeffersonian Republican Party is battling the old Federalist Party for power, and the Jeffersonian Republican Party, led by the first governor of that party, Joseph Bloomfield, who just so happens to be the president of the state's Abolition Society, is really positioning itself as a arbiter or a grantor of freedom. And so in the same way that the Abolition Society is thinking about itself in this way, this politically, New Jersey and the Jeffersonian Republican Party is positioning himself in that way. So what you're looking at now is essentially it's a blank, but it's a membership certificate for the state's Abolition Society. And the image on it is really telling, because what white abolitionists are arguing to themselves at this moment in time is that they are the benevolent grantors of freedom to the enslaved population. Well, in reality, that's not true, as many historians have argued over the last several decades, that slaves themselves are, and free blacks, are very active agents in this abolitionist debate. But when we think about this in a political sense in the state legislature, it is very much this idea of Jeffersonian Republicans trying to solidify themselves in this political game at this moment in time and arguing for freedom for African Americans as a plank of a larger way to establish themselves as kind of the successors to that revolutionary generation, the successors to the American Revolution. If we think about that notion, then for someone like Catherine, 1804 should represent some type of momentous change, that freedom is on its way. In reality, it doesn't do anything for Catherine. Instead, these benevolent, so-called benevolent slave abolitionists, these benevolent abolitionists, actually create an abolition law that is a delayed abolition. That's why it's gradual abolition. So the actual 1804 law doesn't affect slaves like Catherine, who were born before the law went into effect. It only affects children born to slaves after July 4th of 1804. So there's about 13,000 slaves in New Jersey, about 13,000 slaves in New Jersey as of this passage of the law. That's about 6% of the state's population. But in some places in the eastern part of the state, that could be upwards of 20% of the county population as these enslaved individuals. Now, what the law does do is it changes the status of children born after its passage, after July 4th, 1804. So Catherine's children are affected by the law's change, the law, or by the law's passage. The law says that any child born to a slave after July 4th, 1804 will be free, but only after 25 years of service if they're male, or 21 years if they're female, to their mother's master. So this image here, these are two paintings that I was lucky enough to find. They are in the collections of the Cranford Historical Society, which is where I grew up. They are of Jude and Sarah Denman, who are two of these children born after July 4th, 1804, and they are in this kind of quasi state, just like Catherine's two children. So now both of Catherine's children, like Jude and Sarah, are gaining their freedom, but only at the very earliest period of time in the 1830s. So for me as a historian, I really was wanting to delve into, well, what's the status of these children between 1804 and the 1830s, when this first group of children are going to be getting their freedom. Now, the law says that they're going to be serving their mother's master. And the real heart of my research was to try to explore these experiences of these children and how they functioned in this post-abolition world in New Jersey. And northern whites across the North are very struggling with the same question. What is the role of people like Catherine's children, like Jude and Sarah Denman? And the children themselves and their mothers and fathers who are still enslaved are struggling with that same question. So most whites and most the legal cases that come up in the aftermath of the gradual abolition law are really seeing their status as property. They are essentially very not very different than their mothers and fathers that were enslaved. There's very little acknowledgement in any of the ways that they're being dealt with of their future freedom. And indeed, many of them are sold into perpetual slavery in the South to places like Louisiana and Mississippi. And so I call these people, these children that were born after the Gradual Abolition law, slaves for a term. And it really forces us to think about these children in a new way, because they are, for all intents and purposes, functioning just like slaves, except that they have this future freedom date, which they themselves have to, in many ways, argue for and fight for to get recognized. The larger story, as we think about the 19th century, is that New Jersey, as this as Noelle talked about, is this state that's very much a border state as we move closer and closer into the revolution. This map is very, popular map that many of you have probably seen before. It shows, New Jersey as this, free state, but in reality, it's not. Slavery is continuing there very strongly in many places into the 1830s. And New Jersey's status on the border with the slave states really makes New Jersey into this hub for runaway slaves. And as we think about New Jersey in this very pivotal pre-Civil War period, in contrast to other northern states like our neighbor Pennsylvania, that passes very strong personal liberty laws to protect free Blacks, as well as supporting runaway slaves in a variety of different ways. New Jersey doesn't do that. Instead of disowning slavery, which many northern states, especially in New England, tend to do in this period, and erasing it from the political memory, New Jersey really embraces it in this 1830s, 1840s, 1850 time period. So as the nation is battling over slavery and the Civil War, New Jersey politicians on the national stage are actually arguing that, well, New Jersey understands what the Southerners are going through, because New Jersey itself was a slave state. It understands the problem of fugitive slaves, and it understands that, and it makes the very strong point that New Jersey isn't like the rest of the North, that it understands and very much is willing to participate in the recovery of fugitive slaves. And as we think about the causation of the Civil War, the fugitive slave problem for Southerners becomes incredibly important as they move closer and closer to the Civil War. And New Jersey is very much supportive of the return of fugitive slaves versus its neighbor Pennsylvania, which really restricts a lot of those returns of fugitive slaves. So in my work, I've really tried to explore this kind of complicated and elongated end to the institution of slavery from the point of someone like Catherine, who her status doesn't change in 1804. Her children do change status, but they're in this very elongated system where they're essentially slaves until their 20s. And then even after, even as we get to the eve of the Civil War in the mid-1850s, we still have slaves like Catherine who are being sold as we are approaching the Civil War, with the support of the state legislature, who is very supportive of Southerners in thinking about this fugitive recovery model. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions when we get to that part of the program.
Thank you, Dr. Gigantino. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take some questions from the audience. Greer Luce from the New Jersey Historical Commission is going to help us identify some of the questions. I see someone posted a question in the Q&A.
Yes, and we had quite a few come in the chat as well, but we'll start with that question in the Q&A. Why did the eastern part of New Jersey want to keep slavery? That is our first question.
So that's a really great question. There's a couple issues at play. One is, the western part of the state has a very strong Quaker tradition, a very large Quaker population. So that's why the West is declining in terms of its slave population much quicker. The Quakers were much more active at abandoning the institution. In the East, there is a significant interest in slavery still because of the various different ways that that labor can be utilized. So that slave labor as a economic tool becomes very powerful. So, one of the things that I think is central, that slavery is this economic engine. And I think that Eastern New Jerseyans really understood that, and understood that there's a lot of flexibility in that labor, especially as we're thinking about labor markets contracting in the aftermath of the revolution, and it becoming very difficult to get labor for both the household economy as well as agriculture. So there's a lot of flexibility within that enslavement model to have slaves and those people in the East, I think, embrace that, just like people in New York and other places in this kind of 1790s period embrace that too.
Great. This is, I see another comment in, so I want to make sure I get to this question before we move to another question. This is for Dr. Amemasor. I apologize. Are the materials that you shared, are they accessible to the public?
Yes, the New Jersey Historical Society collections are accessible to the public. Anybody who wants to come and do research, we open to the public by appointment right now, and it's Tuesday through Saturday, and by email or phone, and we'll arrange for you to look at whatever you want to look at for research.
Excellent, thank you so much. This question has come in the chat and the Q&A, so I want to make sure we get to it. It's a little bit different. Do you know of any of the New Jersey public schools that may have archival studies as part of their K through 12 curriculum? How might you suggest that archival studies be introduced to K through 12 students?
Yes, if I probably talk about that, as someone who works at the New Jersey Historical Society, we have programs like that for schools. So schools, they arrange, they bring their students there. We have an education department as well. And so they coordinate that and teach them about specific subjects across New Jersey. So as far as schools themselves, I'm not quite sure if they have these kind of programs, but it's a good question.
Great, thank you. I think this may have been addressed, but who or what government agency had the responsibility for overseeing or enforcing the gradual abolition in New Jersey?
That's a really interesting question. There's a couple different pieces to it. So the law required that any child born after 1804 had to be registered. That registration was supposed to be done at the county clerk's office. The problem is that there's no enforcement mechanism for that. Now, when you look at the birth books that the state archives has, and actually the book that I was showing you, Catherine's Bill of Sale is actually a birth book. It's somehow made its way to the Hunterdon County Historical Society. We don't know how, but because it's really a state record. But it's they had to register them in these birth books, but they're in the early period. There's a really strong incentive to register because you actually, it's very difficult, very complicated story, but you got essentially a paycheck for maintaining these children or supporting these children. So there was a financial incentive in that early period, as that essentially almost bankrupts the state. It's almost a third of the state's budget by about 1808, 1809. So they end that program. And so after that time period, you'll see registration. You're supposed to do it within 6 months, and almost no one's doing it in 6 months. That birth record is supposed to be the record that the child could use eventually to prove their date of birth and therefore their freedom date. But what we would see is abolition is arguing for in court to enforce those birth dates or enforce that legal end to that system. So it's the county clerk's office, but also then the courts in the state are trying to do that too.
And we have quite a few questions coming through in the chat, so we'll try and answer a couple more before we close out here, but I know we're getting to the end of our time. In the Q&A here, were enslaved people allowed to argue the question of freedom in the courts? Is there any data on that?
So what, a lot of good research has been done on this question, and what frequently happens is that enslaved people needed white advocates, and so they would work with a variety of different white advocates, and those could be neighbors, they could be owners or former owners, they could be abolitionists, and what we really see is the white advocate being the mechanism by which the slave can make an argument in court. Now, what's really powerful is you actually do see records in those court documents from the slaves themselves telling their story, and it's really that's one of the few times where you see that that voice of the enslaved person. Now, some of those voices are being changed or manipulated by white voices, and so there's a very delicate balance there, but typically you have a white intermediary that's making the argument for the enslaved person for a habeas corpus petition or freedom petition, something like that.
I just wanted to quickly note that there is a case that was decided upon by Justice Hornblower for a fugitive enslaved person from the South who was able to make his way here. And so that's something that I believe both Dr. Jagentino and Dr. Amemasor have discussed in their work. I think we have time for one more question, Greer.
Great. We have a couple of great questions in the Q&A here. So I guess this takes us a little bit out of the historical range here, but it did come in first, so I'm going to address it. Does anyone on the panel have an opinion or thoughts about reparations on federal or state level?
Well, reparations is a very important thing and it has to be pursued. Slavery, as I noted in my concluding slide, quoting a Ghanaian poet and scholar, noted that slavery is the living wound. Let's think about that metaphor for a second. A metaphor of a wound that is living. It's not dead. The surface, maybe, it's a living wound under the patchwork of scars, right? So we have to get back and think comprehensively about what exactly slavery means. and the injury that it has caused and continues to cause. Until we embrace that, and it's not only the work of Black people to do that, it should be a whole country coming to terms with that living wound and trying to see how best that patchwork of scars could be addressed once and for all. And that probably could include reparations. So it is about recognizing it. It's about coming to terms. It's about, putting yourself in somebody's shoes to see what it was. Here is an enslaved person who ran away from Newark, went all the way to Rhode Island, and almost arrested over there. He found a way to get out of that place to Connecticut. And then when they were about to arrest him, he found his way to get out. This was someone who was pursuing freedom. What does that mean for people who were enslaved? These are very big questions that I think the whole country has to come to terms with, to find out what can be done to heal that patchwork of scars, that living wound and the patchwork of scars forever. Otherwise, whole nations cry, sometimes softly, sometimes they cry harshly, and some people don't know why we are crying, because there's a living wound under the patchwork of scars.
Wow, what a powerful quote, James, and thank you for sharing that with us today, especially as we noted last night, the Senate passed, I believe, the resolution to make Juneteenth a national holiday, and it's now going to the House. And in light of our conversations, our communal and national and actually international conversations about history, memory, public monuments, and the role and what history and the recognition of history means today. I think Dr. Amemasor noted in the beginning this concept of what history is considered to be significant. I think a part of the Commission's charge for this year is to really redefine what histories are considered to be significant. We look forward to doing this through this series, Black Is, in our upcoming conference on Indigenous history in New Jersey. And we're also going to have a series of panels during the summer and the fall. Please visit our website, history.newjersey.gov. We're also on Facebook. I just have to say, again, from the bottom of my heart, thank you to Dr. Jagentino and Dr. Amemasor for doing this work. You two have been instrumental in bringing the stories of enslaved people in New Jersey miles from almost, from it not even being a topic that most people and scholars really explored in a very authentic and deep way. And I know how hard it is to do the work, to do the research, to persist. And so I just have to say thank you for that work. And I want to say thank you to Greer for moderating the question and answer. And thank you to all of our attendees and the questions that were not answered. We'll continue to have these conversations in our future series, as well as at the conference and our other program, Revolution NJ. So we look forward to seeing you there. And finally, I just want to return to the question I brought up at the beginning of this conversation, and just to have us think this weekend during Juneteenth, as we commemorate Juneteenth for the first time in New Jersey, as we continue to celebrate Pride and recognize and commemorate Pride in the Stonewall Rebellion. What is at stake if we do not present and learn a more truthful and layered African-American history? What's at stake for our democracy, citizenship, just in our state of being? So again, thank you to everyone, and I look forward to seeing everyone soon.